reminder that freedom requires eternal vigilance and that the price of peace is often measured in the lives of those who serve. The attack's legacy extends beyond military history to fundamental questions about intelligence, preparedness, and democratic resilience. The investigations that followed December 7th revealed systemic failures in communication, analysis, and strategic thinking that led to comprehensive reforms in American intelligence operations. These lessons proved invaluable during the Cold War, when similar vigilance helped prevent nuclear catastrophe. Today, Pearl Harbor stands as both memorial and active naval base, where modern sailors serve alongside the ghosts of December 7th. The harbor that once symbolized American vulnerability now represents American strength and the transformation that can emerge from national tragedy. The attack intended to eliminate American influence in the Pacific instead created the conditions for American dominance that continues to shape global affairs. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto feared to awaken proved more formidable than even he had imagined, transforming the Pacific from Japan's lake into America's highway to victory and lasting peace. Chief Boatswain's mate Edwin Hill volunteered to go ashore to cast off Nevada's mooring lines, swimming through oil-covered flaming water to reach the key. After successfully freeing the battleship, Hill swam back to the ship and climbed aboard, only to be killed by strafing fighters minutes later. His heroic actions enabled Nevada's escape from Battleship Row. At the submarine base, Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge aboard the destroyer USS Ward had already fired the first American shots of the Pacific War at 6:45 that morning, sinking a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. His report of the engagement was initially dismissed by higher headquarters, another in the series of intelligence failures that contributed to the surprise attack's success. The Japanese pilots of the second wave found their targets obscured by smoke and defended by increasingly effective anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, piloting his Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, recalled the difficulty of identifying targets through the black pall hanging over the harbor. Several Japanese aircraft were shot down by the improving American defense, including planes from the carriers Akagi and Soryu. Mess Attendant Third Class Doris Miller, an African-American sailor aboard the USS West Virginia, helped carry wounded officers to safety before manning a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon he had never been trained to operate due to racial segregation policies. Miller fired at attacking aircraft until his ammunition was exhausted, becoming one of the first heroes of America's entry into World War II. By 9:45, the second wave had completed its mission and was heading back toward the Japanese fleet. Commander Fuchida, circling overhead to assess damage, radioed his superiors that the mission had achieved complete success. All 8 American battleships had been either sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would resonate for decades. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, Pearl Harbor lay shrouded in smoke and flame, with over 2,000 Americans dead and the Pacific Fleet crippled. Yet even in defeat, individual acts of heroism had planted the seeds of eventual victory. As the drone of Japanese aircraft engines faded into the distance, Pearl Harbor resembled a vision from hell. Black smoke billowed from the shattered remains of Battleship Row, where the pride of the Pacific Fleet lay broken and burning. The USS Arizona continued to burn with such intensity that her steel structure glowed cherry red, while the capsized Oklahoma trapped hundreds of men in her inverted hull. Rescue operations began immediately, even as the threat of additional attacks loomed over the base. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua organized rescue teams aboard the Arizona, leading men through smoke-filled compartments to search for survivors. The heat was so intense that rescuers could only work in short intervals before being forced to retreat and allow others to continue the desperate search. Hospital Corpsman First Class. William Lynch exemplified the heroism that emerged from tragedy. Despite being wounded by shrapnel, he repeatedly dove into the oil-slicked burning harbor to rescue sailors who had been blown overboard or jumped from sinking ships. Lynch's actions saved dozens of lives, though he would carry the scars of that morning for the rest of his days. The most dramatic rescue operation centered on the USS Oklahoma, where tapping sounds from within the overturned hull indicated trapped survivors. Chief Carpenter's mate Julio de Castro organized cutting teams that worked around the clock to burn through the ship's bottom. Over the next 3 days, 32 men were rescued from air pockets within the capsized battleship, though 419 of Oklahoma's crew had perished. Captain Mervyn Bennion of the USS West Virginia, mortally wounded early in the attack, refused medical attention and continued directing his ship's defense until he died at his post. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillencoder, later testified that Bennion's leadership prevented the ship from capsizing like Oklahoma, saving hundreds of lives through his final sacrifice. The submarine base provided one of the few bright spots in the disaster. The USS Dolphin, Cachalot, and other submarines suffered minimal damage and were able to begin war patrols within days of the attack. Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge's destroyer Ward, which had sunk a Japanese midget submarine before the main attack, continued patrolling the harbor approaches. Medical personnel worked miracles under impossible conditions. The base hospital, designed for 50 patients, suddenly faced over 1,000 casualties. Chief Pharmacist's mate, William Morehouse, organized triage operations while Navy nurses like Lieutenant Ruth Erickson worked without rest to save lives. Many of the wounded were burned by flaming oil, requiring specialized treatment that stretched medical resources to their limits. The fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, surprisingly undamaged by the Japanese attack, proved crucial to recovery efforts. These tank farms contained 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, enough to supply the Pacific Fleet for months. Had the Japanese destroyed these facilities, it would have taken years to rebuild America's Pacific naval capability. Commander Logan Ramsey at Ford Island had transmitted the famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill," at 7:58 in the morning, alerting the entire Pacific Command to the reality of war. His quick thinking enabled other bases throughout Hawaii and the Pacific to prepare for potential follow-up attacks. Intelligence officers immediately began assessing the attack's strategic implications. Captain Edwin Layton, Admiral Kimmel's intelligence officer, recognized that the absence of American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor represented a crucial Japanese failure. The USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea, preserving America's most valuable naval assets for the long war ahead. The human cost was staggering: 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded. The material losses included 4 battleships sunk, 4 damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers sunk, and 188 aircraft destroyed. Yet within these statistics lay the seeds of American determination and the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the Pacific forever. News of the Pearl Harbor attack spread across the American mainland like wildfire, transforming a nation still clinging to isolationist sentiment into a unified force, determined to win at any cost. Radio broadcasts interrupted Sunday afternoon programming to deliver the shocking news that the United States had been thrust into the global conflict it had tried so desperately to avoid. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt interrupted during a lunch meeting at the White House, immediately convened his cabinet and military advisors. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox's initial telephone report seemed so incredible that Roosevelt demanded confirmation before accepting the reality that America's Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a surprise attack. The president began crafting what would become one of history's most memorable speeches, preparing to address Congress and request a declaration of war. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, surveyed the devastation from his headquarters overlooking the harbor. The admiral who had confidently declared Pearl Harbor impregnable now faced the wreckage of his fleet and the end of his career. Within days, both Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short would be relieved of command, becoming scapegoats for intelligence failures that extended far beyond their individual responsibilities. The attack's psychological impact proved as significant as its material damage. Americans who had dismissed the possibility of foreign attack on their homeland suddenly faced the reality that enemy aircraft could strike anywhere. The myth of oceanic security, reinforced by geography and 2 centuries of relative isolation, shattered along with the battleships at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz received orders to assume command of the Pacific Fleet while the harbor still burned. The soft-spoken Texan faced the daunting task of rebuilding American naval power from the wreckage of December 7th. His first priority was salvaging the damaged battleships and restoring Pearl Harbor's capacity to support fleet operations. The USS California, Nevada, and West Virginia would eventually be raised, rebuilt, and returned to service, their crews eager for revenge against the empire that had awakened the sleeping giant. Intelligence analysis revealed the attack's strategic limitations. Captain Joseph Rochefort's cryptographers at Station Hypo had been tracking Japanese naval movements for months, but the attack fleet had maintained perfect radio silence during its approach. The Japanese success resulted more from American complacency than superior intelligence work. More importantly, the failure to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and submarine base would prove a crucial Japanese error. The industrial mobilization that followed December 7th transformed America into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factory production shifted from automobiles to aircraft, from consumer goods to munitions. The attack had united Americans behind a common cause in a way that years of political rhetoric could never have achieved. Isolationist sentiment virtually disappeared overnight as the nation prepared for total war. Young men lined up at recruiting stations in unprecedented numbers. The attack had created a generation of Americans determined to avenge Pearl Harbor and defeat fascism wherever it threatened freedom. Among them was future President John Kennedy, whose PT boat service in the Pacific would be directly inspired by the events of December 7th. The Japanese celebration of their tactical success masked a strategic blunder of historic proportions. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, privately worried that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The admiral's concerns proved prophetic, as America's industrial might, once mobilized for war, would prove unstoppable. Within hours of the attack, FBI agents were rounding up suspected Japanese sympathizers on the West Coast, beginning the tragic internment program that would stain America's wartime record. Fear and prejudice, unleashed by the surprise attack, led to the imprisonment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them loyal citizens whose only crime was their ancestry. The international implications extended far beyond the Pacific. Adolf Hitler, initially pleased by Japan's success, made the fatal decision to declare war on the United States on December 11th, bringing America fully into the European conflict as well. The weeks following the Pearl Harbor attack witnessed one of the most remarkable recoveries in naval history. While the nation mourned its dead and planned for war, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers began the Herculean task of raising and rebuilding the Pacific Fleet. The harbor that had been a scene of destruction became a symbol of American industrial determination and engineering prowess. Salvage operations began within hours of the attack's end. Captain Homer Wallen, Pearl Harbor's salvage officer, assembled teams of divers, welders, and engineers to assess the damage and plan recovery operations. The USS Arizona, too badly damaged to salvage, would remain where she sank as a permanent memorial to the attack's victims. However, the other battleships presented engineering challenges that American ingenuity would ultimately overcome. The USS Oklahoma proved the most difficult salvage operation. The completely capsized battleship required an elaborate system of winches and cables to slowly roll her upright over a period of months. Chief Warrant Officer William Bartholomew supervised the dangerous work, which required cutting through the ship's hull to remove trapped water and debris. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations, though Oklahoma was too damaged for combat restoration. Meanwhile, the USS West Virginia underwent one of the most extensive rebuilds in naval history. Raised from the harbor bottom after being sunk by 6 torpedoes, she was completely gutted and reconstructed with modern fire control systems, radar, and anti-aircraft defenses. When she returned to service in 1944, West Virginia was essentially a new ship built around the salvaged hull of the old one. Admiral Chester Nimitz established his Pacific Fleet headquarters in a building overlooking the harbor, where Arizona's superstructure still protruded above the waterline. The new commander faced strategic decisions that would determine the course of the Pacific War. With his battleships gone, Nimitz was forced to rely on aircraft carriers and submarines, a tactical limitation that would prove strategically advantageous. As naval warfare evolved, the intelligence war intensified dramatically after Pearl Harbor. Captain Joseph Rochefort's code breakers at Station Hypo worked around the clock to penetrate Japanese naval communications. Their success in breaking the JN-25 code would prove crucial in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, transforming the intelligence failure of December 7th into the strategic advantage that won the Pacific War. Production miracles emerged from American shipyards and aircraft factories. The Kaiser shipyards in California began producing Liberty ships at an unprecedented rate, while Boeing, Consolidated, and other manufacturers ramped up aircraft production to levels that would have seemed impossible before the war. The attack had revealed American vulnerability, but also unleashed the industrial capacity that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers. Submarine warfare began immediately from Pearl Harbor's largely undamaged submarine base. The USS Pompano departed on war patrol just 3 days after the attack, beginning the campaign that would eventually strangle Japan's maritime supply lines. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Parks and other submarine skippers carried the war directly to Japanese home waters while the surface fleet rebuilt. The human dimension of recovery proved equally remarkable. Survivors of the attack formed the nucleus of a veteran force determined to avenge their fallen shipmates. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, badly burned aboard Arizona, recovered from his wounds and returned to combat duty aboard another ship. His story epitomized the resilience that characterized America's response to the attack. Training programs expanded exponentially as the Navy prepared for a two-ocean war. The Naval Academy at Annapolis accelerated its curriculum, graduating classes early to provide officers for the expanding fleet. Naval flight training centers from Pensacola to Corpus Christi worked around the clock to produce the aviators who would carry the war to Japan's empire. The strategic transformation of American naval doctrine began at Pearl Harbor. The attack had demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate future naval warfare. Admiral Nimitz embraced this reality, organizing his fleet around fast carrier task forces that could strike anywhere in the Pacific with devastating effectiveness. By the spring of 1942, Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a scene of disaster into the headquarters of American resurgence in the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor fundamentally transformed not only the Pacific theater, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. What began as Japan's attempt to cripple American naval power became the catalyst for America's emergence as the dominant global superpower. The date, which will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt declared, marked the end of American isolationism and the beginning of the American century. The strategic consequences of December 7th extended far beyond the immediate military damage. Japan's surprise attack unified American public opinion in a way that no amount of political rhetoric could have achieved. The isolationist movement, which had commanded significant support before Pearl Harbor, virtually disappeared overnight. Americans who had been reluctant to enter foreign wars suddenly embraced total commitment to defeating fascism wherever it threatened freedom. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient warning about awakening a sleeping giant proved tragically accurate from Japan's perspective. American industrial production, once mobilized for war, dwarfed anything the Axis powers could achieve. By 1944, American shipyards were launching more vessels in a single month than Japan produced during the entire war. The attack that was intended to prevent American interference in Japanese expansion instead guaranteed that interference would be overwhelming and decisive. The intelligence lessons learned from Pearl Harbor revolutionized American cryptographic capabilities. Captain Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo transformed the failure of December 7th into the triumph of Midway, where advanced knowledge of Japanese plans enabled Admiral Nimitz to position his forces for a decisive victory. The same intelligence techniques later provided crucial advantages in the European theater, contributing to Allied success in the Battle of the Atlantic and the Normandy invasion. The human cost of Pearl Harbor created a generation of Americans motivated by personal loss and national humiliation. Survivors of the attack became living symbols of American resilience, many returning to combat with a determination that their Japanese attackers had not anticipated. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a battle cry that echoed from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, inspiring American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign. Pearl Harbor's transformation from disaster to symbol reflected broader changes in American society. The attack shattered the myth of oceanic security that had shaped American strategic thinking since the nation's founding. Geographic isolation, which had protected America through 2 world wars, suddenly seemed inadequate in an age of long-range aviation and global conflict. This realization would drive American foreign policy for decades after the war's end. The salvage and reconstruction operations at Pearl Harbor demonstrated American engineering and industrial capabilities that would prove decisive throughout the war. Ships that seemed beyond repair were raised, rebuilt, and returned to combat with improvements that made them more effective than their original configurations. The USS Nevada, beached during the attack, returned to service in time to bombard German positions during the Normandy landings, symbolizing America's global reach and determination. The memorial established at the Arizona's resting place became a shrine to American sacrifice and resolve. More than 2 million visitors annually pay their respects to the 1,100 sailors and Marines still entombed within the sunken battleship's hull. The memorial serves as The morning of December 7th, 1941, began like any other peaceful Sunday in Hawaii. Across the sprawling naval base at Pearl Harbor, sailors aboard the USS Arizona prepared for what they believed would be another routine day in paradise. The gentle Pacific breeze carried the scent of tropical flowers across Ford Island, where mechanics tinkered with aircraft engines and officers reviewed their weekly reports over steaming cups of coffee. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles one final time as his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber lifted off from the aircraft carrier Akagi, leading a formation of 183 Japanese aircraft into the dawn sky. 600 miles north of Oahu, the most audacious military operation in Pacific history was already in motion. The first wave of attackers included 49 level bombers, 40 dive bombers, 51 dive bombers of a different type, and 43 fighters, all heading toward their unsuspecting target. At Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on his headquarters balcony, watching the morning sun paint the harbor in golden hues. The Pacific Fleet's battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, sat majestically at their moorings like sleeping giants. These mighty vessels represented America's naval power in the Pacific, their 16-inch guns capable of hurling shells 20 miles with devastating accuracy. The intelligence failures that would later haunt military historians were already accumulating like storm clouds. Japanese diplomatic codes had been intercepted and decoded through Operation Magic, revealing increasing tensions, but the specific target and timing remained hidden in the fog of war. Lieutenant General Walter Short had received warnings about potential sabotage, but had focused his preparations on protecting against internal threats rather than aerial assault. According to historical accounts documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Japanese had been planning this operation for months under the code name Operation Hawaii, later changed to Operation Z in honor of Admiral Togo's famous signal at the Battle of Tsushima. The attack fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, maintaining strict radio silence as they crossed 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. Private First Class Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were manning the Opana Point radar station on Oahu's north shore when their oscilloscope screen began showing unusual readings. At 7:02 in the morning, they detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, approximately 137 miles away. Their report to the information center was dismissed by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who assumed the blips were either American B-17 flying fortresses expected from California or Navy planes on routine patrol. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, were experiencing their own moments of tension and anticipation. Flight Petty Officer Zenji Abe, flying in the second wave, later recalled the mixture of excitement and fear as the Hawaiian Islands appeared through the morning haze. The mountains of Oahu rose from the sea like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in clouds that would soon be pierced by the thunder of war. As Commander Fuchida's formation approached the north shore of Oahu, the peaceful Sunday morning was about to shatter into fragments of steel and fire that would echo through history. At 7:48 in the morning, Commander Fuchida's voice crackled across the radio frequencies as he transmitted the historic code words Tora, Tora, Tora to the Japanese fleet, signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, Pearl Harbor spread out like a detailed model, with the American Pacific Fleet arranged in perfect target formation along Battleship Row. The first bombs fell on Ford Island at 7:55, shattering the Sunday morning silence, with thunderous explosions that sent columns of black smoke spiraling into the tropical sky. Dive bombers screamed down from above while torpedo bombers skimmed just feet above the harbor's surface, their deadly fish racing toward the hulls of America's mightiest warships. Aboard the USS Arizona, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd was preparing for a morning inspection when the first wave struck. The battleship's crew, many still in their dress whites from Saturday evening's shore leave, scrambled to battle stations as general quarters sounded throughout the fleet. Gunner's Mate First Class Vernon Olson rushed to his anti-aircraft station, shouting orders to his crew as Japanese fighters strafed the deck with machine gun fire. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the Maryland, became an immediate target for Japanese torpedo bombers. Lieutenant Commander Jesse Kenworthy watched in horror as torpedo after torpedo slammed into the ship's port side. The massive battleship began listing heavily to port as flooding overwhelmed her compartments. Within minutes, Oklahoma was rolling over, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her steel hull. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg stood on Arizona's bridge, calmly directing damage control efforts even as enemy aircraft swarmed overhead like angry hornets. The battleship's main battery turrets trained skyward, their 5-inch guns beginning to fire at the attacking aircraft. But the Japanese had planned their assault with devastating precision, focusing their heaviest weapons on the fleet's most powerful units. At 8:06, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, dropped from a high-altitude bomber, penetrated Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion that followed was visible from 20 miles away, sending a fireball 800 feet into the air and lifting the 35,000-ton battleship out of the water. The blast killed Rear Admiral Kidd, Captain Van Valkenburg, and over 1,000 members of Arizona's crew in an instant. The USS West Virginia, commanded by Captain Mervyn Bennion, fought valiantly against the torpedo attack that sent 6 fish into her port side. Despite mortal wounds from shrapnel, Captain Bennion remained at his post, directing counterflooding efforts to keep his ship upright. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillencoeter, later described the captain's final moments as embodying the highest traditions of naval service. Meanwhile, at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, Japanese fighters and dive bombers were systematically destroying American aircraft caught on the ground. Colonel William Farthing, commanding Hickam Field, watched helplessly as his B-17 and B-18 bombers erupted in flames. The aircraft had been positioned wingtip to wingtip as protection against sabotage, making them perfect targets for aerial attack. Fighter pilots who managed to reach their aircraft faced overwhelming odds. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, stationed at Halewa Field, succeeded in getting their P-40 Warhawks airborne and engaged the Japanese formation. Despite being outnumbered 50-1, they managed to shoot down several enemy aircraft before being forced to land and rearm. The harbor itself had become a hell of smoke, flame, and twisted metal. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the water's surface, igniting into sheets of flame that trapped swimmers trying to reach shore. Hospital Corpsman Second Class. William Lynch dove repeatedly into the burning water to rescue wounded sailors, his actions later earning him the Medal of Honor. By 8:30, the first wave had completed its devastating work and was heading back toward the Japanese fleet. At 8:40, just as the smoke from the first attack began to settle over Pearl Harbor, Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave of 171 Japanese aircraft toward their targets. Unlike the first wave's focus on battleships, this assault concentrated on destroying fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and any remaining operational aircraft. The defenders were now alert and fighting back with desperate fury. Every available anti-aircraft gun from ships and shore installations filled the sky with deadly flak. The destroyer USS Helm, one of the few ships to get underway during the attack, opened fire on a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter the harbor. Seaman First Class William McCarthy manned his 20-millimeter gun aboard the cruiser. USS Raleigh, tracking enemy dive bombers as they screamed toward their targets. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua aboard the burning Arizona organized rescue efforts while dodging strafing attacks from Japanese fighters. Despite the ship being a total loss, Fuqua's leadership saved dozens of lives as he directed survivors to abandon ship while maintaining defensive fire. His actions under impossible conditions would later earn him the Medal of Honor. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American resilience. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the ship's navigator, conned the vessel down the channel toward the harbor entrance, while Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the moving target. Realizing that Nevada might block the channel if she sank, Rear Admiral William Furlong signaled her to beach herself at Hospital Point rather than risk closing the harbor to future operations.